Welcome to Entraz. In this video we're going to be talking about how to set up a Windows or Linux server in ESXi. Now currently we have ESXi 6.7, I believe. You'll see here we have a lot of information that it could tell us. We're running 6.7.0 update 2 and I have quite a few resources available, so I don't think it should be an issue. One of the first things we have to make sure we have is storage. In this case I have local data stores and ESXi based data stores. So if we come over here to our data store for my hard drives and go to data store browser, we can click on my ISOs directory, which you'll notice I was able to upload a lot of these files. If we expand this, we can make it a little longer but not wider, so you kind of need to know what the name of your ISO is. In this case, Server 2019 ISO. It's almost about 5 gigabytes. So we see that this is here, we're good to go. Now there's a lot of different ways to create virtual machines, but since this is a Microsoft video, we'll make it very simple for you. So we'll just create and register a virtual machine, create a new one. We also have the ability to do open virtualization files if we have one of those, or registering an existing if we have one in our storage already. So we come over here, we create a name. Let's just say initial setup. We can choose our compatibility. In this case, all the servers in my environment are running at least 6.7. We could also choose update 2 if we wanted to. We'll have to go through VMware's documentation to see what update 2 gives us as far as compatibility is concerned. For now, we'll just come in here and choose Windows. And sadly 19 is not listed, so we have to do 16 or later. We can also enable Windows virtualization based security if we wanted to do hardware virtualizations, IOMMU, EFI, and secure boot options. In this case, I'm not going to worry about that for now. We'll just move forward. We'll then want to choose which storage we want, if it's standard or if we have persistent memory in our box, which of course I don't. So let's stick with our ESXi SSD. From here we can customize the settings. For CPU, we can specify the number of sockets and the cores per socket. So in this case, I have a single processor, so I'll have a single socket. If I was going to have a multiple processor system, I might say 1 core per socket. That way it kind of do its load balancing over the physical hardware. But in this case we don't, so let's just specify it's a quad core system and it's a single socket. We can also choose enable CPU hot add if we're running a version of an operating system that allows this. I could be mistaken, but I believe only Data Center Edition allows hot plug, so if you're running standard this might not work. Down here we have our memory. Now keep in mind we have to be wary of how much memory we have available and in use in our system. So in this case we'll just give it 8 gigs. Hopefully that'll be good. One of the cool things about reservations is that VMs use swap. So if you didn't want it to swap back and forth to your physical disk, we can reserve all guest memory and that swap will not exist. This is especially good if we're running on an SSD system, because you really don't want a lot of unnecessary read-write I/O on the system, so we can reserve it all, and you'll notice we'll take up that entire 8 gigs. From here, we specify hard disk, and we'll just leave this as 40. But one of the big things you always need to remember is that it is thick provisioned, lazily zeroed by default. So if you want this entire 40 gigs to be taken up, lazily or eagerly would be good. But I prefer thin provisioning because it just works. And if you give something like 10 terabytes, it'll only actually use what it's written to. ESXi controllers, we'll use the Logic SAS. I have my network adapter, which is going to be an emulated E1000, but we can also use single root I/O virtualization pass-through if we have that capability, or VMXNet 3 if we have 10 gig. As far as MAC address is concerned, we'll just have it do it automatically, and we need to choose our data store ISO file that we looked at earlier, which was in my ISOs directory on my hard drive data store. So we'll select server 2019, good, next, finish. Down here under recent tasks, it'll create the VM, and you'll see it is now listed here under initial setup. So we can click on initial setup, which will take us to the virtual machine page where we can power it on and open the web console. Since we loaded that CD in there, you'll see here that our removable devices are currently attached. From here you can also edit settings, permissions, notes, and other various things such as powering off, suspending, resetting, shut down and restarting if VMware Tools is installed. Now, one of the whack things about server sometimes is you might not have pointer accessibility. Luckily here we do. It happens to me a lot within vCenter where I can't use my mouse cursor. But we'll just come through and do an install now. Wait for the setup to start. And you'll get an option to choose the standard or data center editions. Of course, this is evaluation, so you get these options here. But we have the core edition, which is CLI and PowerShell or remote only, or the desktop experience where you actually have the GUI. For this, we'll do the desktop experience and hit next. We'll accept the license terms, a whole bunch of them. And then of course, custom install Windows only, because we don't have an existing installation. The drive space can be an issue sometimes depending on if you have SCSI drivers or RAID drivers or whatnot, but one of the nice things about VMware is a lot of these drivers, especially LSI Logic SAS, are built into VMware and Windows, so we probably shouldn't have an issue with the loading driver options. From here we just hit next, and we'll pause the video while it installs. So after you're done installing and you put an administrator password, you'll come to the Control-Alt-Delete screen, which you can come up here to Actions, Guest OS, and Send Keys Control-Alt-Delete. This will allow you to log in with that administrator password, and it'll boot into Windows Server. It of course starts you off with Server Manager. Talks about one of the new items within Windows, the Admin Center. We'll talk about that a little later. But one of the first few things you want to do here is local server, and change the computer name, change the workgroup name, potentially change the firewall, remote desktop, teaming, and of course the IP address. In this case we have an IP address assigned by DHCP, so we can come in here, hit properties, and we can change the IP address. Use the following: IP address, subnet mask, gateway, and of course the DNS servers for your local Active Directory servers. For now we'll cancel this. One of the things that you must always remember to do, more of a best practice, very good practice to do, is to install VMware Tools. So under Guest OS, install VMware Tools, and it should mount and load. If not, come down here to the file icon, this PC, and VMware Tools. VMware Tools does a lot of good modifications to the system and allows it to work a lot more efficiently. So we'll come in here and do the installer. Next. Typical is usually fine. Complete is also good. Or custom if you want to change the location of the install. Well, next, install, and I believe it'll make us do a reboot. So you see here it's installing all of the really cool drivers that VMware has, such as VMXNet 3, some of the video drivers, etc. Once this is done, it'll make us restart our system. And because we are virtualized running on SSD, this should be really quick. So about 14 seconds later, do our same thing, Control-Alt-Delete, and we can get back into our system. So let's move this down a bit. There you go. Once again, we hit no, and we have our server that we can manage. Now this will pretty much be what you get if you get something from Entraz. However, we're going to get out of this initial setup for the moment, and we're going to check out our remote.entraz.com, where I have a server ready to go. So I'm going to come in here. I created this virtual machine pretty much for this video series here. So here, once we connect into Entraz Training as a Service, most of the time you'll come to a locked screen or a signed out screen. So if we were to lock the system here, you might ask yourself, how do we do a Control-Alt-Delete? If we do that on our keyboard, it'll lock the machine we're working on. So down here at the bottom, we have a bar that is hopefully on by default, where you can type Control-Alt and hit the Delete key. That'll load us into our login. However, if you do a Control-Alt-Shift, it'll open up this input method option where we can have the on-screen keyboard, as you see here, or the text input, which I believe is a little bit easier. Click Control, click Alt, and press the Delete key on your keyboard, and you'll be able to get in. Make sure you either get rid of this or uncheck these options before you log in. And there you go. We are now in our remote.entraz.com as a service provided virtual machine. So you can come in here, look at your local server, and you'll notice that we have Ethernet 0 configured and with an IP address on it. Now, having this IP address is pretty much for our system to communicate. Since we are using VNC, try not to change this IP address or do anything with the service, otherwise you will lose access and need to call support@entraz.com. Anyway, from here, you have your full-blown Windows server. So let's check out some information. So we currently have an i7-8807G running 3.1 gigahertz, 2 gigs of RAM, and I believe it's a single processor. If we come over here to Task Manager, more details, performance, that's what I've currently given this system. A single socket, 2 gigs of RAM. Now keep in mind, you can get more sockets and more RAM. Might just be a little bit more of a cost, but you have the ability to request and have more if the performance is kind of degraded. Now keep in mind, all of my systems will be running on Xeon processors. This is just a test setup to go through this particular video series. So close out of here. You can come here to computer name, change the computer name to whatever you want, Tim DC1. I like to do that with my name so I know what it is. Me, domain controller number 1, because this will become a domain controller. So once you change the computer name, it'll ask you to restart the computer to apply this particular name. So here we go, let's restart yet again. Of course, because it restarted, the remote desktop server will not work. That's because, of course, the server's not running, the box is rebooting, and hopefully within about 12 to 15 seconds, we'll be able to reconnect. And there you go. It took a little while, probably about 20 or 25 seconds, but remember, it's got to reboot and the services have to restart. So if we come in here and type our password, nothing's going to happen. That's because we have to deselect Control and Alt. So once we log in and are back into Windows, Server Manager will then come back up. We can look back at our local server and see that our name has been changed. Keep in mind that Server Manager does and can take a long time depending on how many servers are linked with this particular server management snap-in. So computer name is changed. I turned firewall off because I just don't like the Windows firewall. A lot of the times you'll use something like McAfee. We have antivirus, it's on by default. Remote desktop's enabled so you can RDP between systems if you have more than one. And like I was talking about before, we will always have an Ethernet 0 in the 172.16 network, but if you have multiple servers and or clients, you will have a second or potentially third Ethernet adapter that you can assign an IP address yourself. So yeah, that's pretty much how you install Windows Server 2019. It's pretty simple, straightforward, especially in a VMware environment. We just map an ISO, create the VM, install server, hopefully come in here and set up VMware tools, give an IP address, and hopefully you'll be good to go. One of the other things you need to keep in mind, however, especially if you're in a virtual environment, is you have to make sure you have your VM on the correct VLAN. Now we'll get into this a little bit more when I do my ESXi course, but you need to make sure your network adapter is in the VLAN or port group where it can communicate on that particular network with your outside network devices. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any things you want to add, questions, hopefully this will be the start to a good video series. I believe the next one we'll start off in was probably how to install roles, features, and Active Directory. Probably be a duplicate of the one I have already, but hey, this will be my new series. Hope to see you in the next one.